Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's early Thursday morning, so hopefully people had enough time to get their questions in, but if not, as always, just re-ask in next week's question or DM me if it's important. So let's jump in and see what we got. First up, on Floatplane, Another Hue has an early 2000s CRT with component video input, but they've had mixed results driving it via direct video from the Mister. So if you're going Mister to direct video, which is the HDMI to probably you would start with VGA conversion and then into component video, you have to add another small circuit to it, which is why I really liked Greg from Laser Bear's adapter. That's still available, and that was sold with the Ranky HDMI to VGA converter, which is both awesome and terrible at the exact same time. It's awesome first because of its price, but also because of its compatibility. It really accepts everything that I throw at it. Now, it's also terrible because it doesn't perform nearly as well as other DACs out there, but it's a trade-off, and it's a recommendation I still to this day stand by, because you could pick this thing up and have a solution right now and then pull out the DAC, and if we ever get another one, you could still use Greg's circuit. You could use this as a tool in your toolbox. I mean, when things are less than $10, I don't mind saying, hey, this isn't great, but it's also really useful because, whereas if that DAC was $100, I would say never ever buy it. It's a waste of money. So context is really key for stuff like that. So if you really wanted to experiment more with direct video, I would absolutely pick one of those up. I'll leave a link in to Greg's page in the write-up I did on it, but I think that one's a good option for this exact scenario. But I'm going to continue the question. They switched to the old analog I/O board, so the basic analog I/O that would come with all of the Mister kits up until this year, up until 2024, and things mostly work well, though the TV seems to need a bright scene to lock in the sync before it stops rolling. That's interesting. I don't run into that very often, so there might actually be something going on with your CRT that causes that. There could be, it could be the same thing that's having issues with direct video, because I don't think I've run into that really with any of the CRTs I've used. Double check all of your settings too. Make sure your Mr. INI file is okay. And if you have any questions about that, rename your current Mr. INI file to _ backup or original or whatever, download a brand new one from GitHub, and then just change all the settings and see if that fixes it. So to continue Another Hue's questions, do I think direct video with a VGA to component transcoder would help? So it could, but those could potentially add some other weirdness to it. Like the most famous one is the Wii gets a purple tint at the menus very often with a lot of these the transcoders, and usually in game there isn't a problem. So you might run into weird issues like that. So a good transcoder like the RetroTink transcoder, so you would go from SCART to component, or in this case, you would probably go from VGA to the HD15 to SCART to the Tink transcoder to component. Those are excellent, and they're definitely worth buying if you think you're going to use them for other things. But based on price alone, I would start with a cheap DAC, and I would start with the Greg thing that I'm going to leave linked for you. So it could work. You could try a cheap transcoder from Amazon or AliExpress, but then you're really rolling the dice. Did anybody test the video output? Are the voltages safe to use? Are they doing the transcoding in the power circuit properly? Are you going to get a green or purple tint across all of your images? There's a lot that can go wrong with transcoding. It's not as easy as copying and pasting a data sheet and spinning off a board, although many people thought it was for a long time. So if you're going to drop the money on a transcoder, I would get a decent one. And once again, if you're going to use it for multiple things, absolutely pick up the Tink transcoder. And if not, I don't know, I would start with the other one. And side note about the brightness thing, on 100 IRE test in the 240p test suite, if they switch inputs away from the Mister and back again, it can't sync. But if they knock it up to 110, it locks on. They're set up for YPB-PR native as per the CRT config in the Mister docs. So that's weird. That could be a whole bunch of different issues, and my gut is telling me there could be some other problem with your CRT. So do you have other consoles that you connect to it via component, and do they ever have issues with dim screens or switching resolutions, 240p, 480i or anything like that? So hopefully I was able to at least point you in somewhat the right direction, but if you have any more questions or you want to keep troubleshooting, please just keep asking. I'd love to make sure you got this worked out. Now, over on Patreon, Steven Sanders said they've done some research on modding the original Xbox since they posted their question from last week, and they found the RAM upgrade to 128 megabytes and the CPU upgrade to 1.4 gigahertz. However, they've struggled to find any videos on how those upgrades affect original physical content. One video showed Half-Life with a stable 30 frames per second, but they're not sure how believable that is. Do I think these upgrades would affect load times or frames per second for physical discs? Or are those physical discs locked into what original OG Xbox hardware was? So I'm not an expert at this. My guess, based on a long time of messing around with this stuff, is that you would require patched versions of the games, which maybe you could load a patch on your hard drive and then boot the disc. But I think it's going to be one of those things where overall you would want to just load the game onto the hard drive, patch it there, and then run it with the enhancements. I've absolutely seen games patched to have some sort of enhancements for those, but since I'm not an expert, I can't really tell you how big of a difference it really feels like. So this is one of those things where I wish I had more knowledge on this one, but my gut's also telling me it's not a night or day difference. You're not going to do these mods and then all of a sudden half of the Xbox library is playable in 720p at 60 frames per second. It's not going to be a huge jump. And in fact, I've seen a couple of people show me original Xbox games running on the latest version of the Xbox via emulation, and it looks way better. So if you're looking to enhance original Xbox games, you might want to look into other methods. However, if you're looking to upgrade the CPU and RAM to use some of the homebrew that's Xbox specific, then sure, go check out some of the other things it can do. Now, once again, I'm not an expert. Those are mostly guesses, but I've been in the Xbox scene for a long enough time where I think that's accurate, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think my perspective of just discs into an Xbox with this isn't going to be a huge difference, something that people would run out and want to do to theirs. Next up, Acnaut54 is curious about Dreamcast VGA output. They have a SCART setup and currently use a cheap Dreamcast VGA cable running into an HD15 to SCART adapter, and it looks good to them. They just always wondered why something like a Behar Brothers VGA box or similar device is needed and what advantages they have. So the main advantage of an external VGA box, assuming one's built correctly, is that you could flip between RGB and VGA output, which is helpful if you're going to a multi-format CRT and you also want to play games in 240p like Third Strike, or if you're playing the very few games that are not patched for 480i yet, or if you insist on using original discs and you don't use the patches at all, which is you really should if you have a 480p compatible anything. So that's the main difference. There were also versions of that box that had scanline generation built in, which 10 years ago might have been neat, but now, no disrespect, right? Technology changes, more options come along, and basic scan lines don't really look the same when you put them next to other better options that are out there. There's also other boxes that have like HDMI output too, but that's still a converter and it's everything built into one. So what I suggest is that if you only care about 480p, which is most people using Dreamcast these days, you're going into a scaler to a flat panel, maybe you've got an amazing PC VGA monitor, CRT monitor, but that's really where you're going to get the best quality out of your Dreamcast. So I would suggest a cheap VGA cable, and if you're going into a SCART setup, exactly what you chose, the HD15 to SCART. If you get some interference, you got unlucky and you got a crappy VGA cable. Even the cheap ones have been much better quality these days than they were over 10 years ago when I started RetroRGB. So you could get lucky with just a $10 cable. The only thing that I would suggest differently is if you have a setup that can accept all of those resolutions and you do want to take advantage of some of those 480i only or 240p games, I would get the cable. I wouldn't get a breakout box. Those breakout boxes very often had pigtails go bad. I think Jose probably did about 100 of those over the years where he had to repair them, some multiple times. And you have this box dangling out the back of your Dreamcast. I strongly prefer the cables that just plug in, that have a little switch in the back that output to SCART or component video, whichever one, depending on your setup. So that's what I would suggest if you need multiple resolutions. If you only need 480p, stick with what you got because it's absolutely perfect. I'll leave a link to the Dreamcast section that has all of these different cables and options in it. But basically, I mean this in a good way, Acna. If what you have is working, stick with it because you're probably not going to get any performance boost at all unless you got unlucky and have unshielded VGA cables. And if you don't need access to those other modes of the games, then spending any more money might be just useless. Next up, Tony Escobar has a question about TapTo, that awesome NFC project that allows you to program NFC cards with games and launch them via your MiSTer. So you essentially have physical media-ish that you tap onto these readers and that automatically loads the game. And the question is, how do I sync it to games hosted on my RetroNAS? All I did was use the web app, Wizzo's remote app, through a web browser to do it. And it was super, super easy. And since I've already mapped the MiSTer to my RetroNAS, when I scrolled through the games list, that's where they all were. So if you use the remote app to do it, it really is just as easy as if it were local. The only thing you would have to remember is set up RetroNAS first on your MiSTer, make sure you could load a game off of it, and then that's it. And you don't even need to worry about power cycling because once that's set up, after you've rebooted your MiSTer, it'll just work. Now, MiSTer takes a long time to connect to the network, so don't worry if you boot it up immediately and it doesn't work. Give it like a full minute or two, and then once you see the network icon, that's when you could do it. So it really is that easy. Wizzo's remote app, the free one for your web browser is all I would need. If you wanted the one for your phone too, that's also fun, but you really could do all of this with the free apps, and obviously you'd have to buy the NFC cards and hardware, but those are pretty cheap too. So great question. That's how I load my games via TapTo, and it's always worked perfect, provided I'm actually connected to the network. Next up, Mecha Crisis has a question about enhanced video versus an RGB mod on the Nintendo 64. They haven't found any information on which is better and was wondering if the quality of one is better over the other, or are they the same in quality? I have to assume that you're talking about the enhanced S-Video feature of the RetroTink 4K, because there is no enhanced S-Video mod for the N64. So I'm going to assume that's what you mean. If I'm wrong, I apologize. Please correct me and I'll fix it next week. But if you're talking about using a quality S-Video cable, a shielded one, not some AliExpress junk, into the rear port of the RetroTink 4K via something like the Laser Bear adapter, versus an RGB mod done internally on the N64 with a quality shielded RGB SCART cable, the RGB mods are always going to be better because it's direct RGB uncompressed signal right from the chips on the N64. However, the goal of the Tink's enhanced S-Video is to help for stuff like this because you don't need to mod your N64 for an S-Video cable. Assuming you're NTSC and you have most of the PAL models that could support it, there's another gotcha in there, but if you're talking about NTSC, there's never a mod needed. You just plug in your quality S-Video cable. Versus if you're going to RGB mod it, do you have a version of the motherboard that you can do an easy mod? If that's the case, that might actually be a great option for you, especially if you don't have either of those cables yet. So you just buy the shielded RGB cable, do the mod yourself, and you're good to go. However, what if you have one of those N64 models that requires the advanced mod? At that point, you might as well do an HDMI mod to it and have direct signal out going to your Tink 4K or maybe even directly to your TV, because that's a lot of work. And if you have to pay somebody, you'd have to pay them the same amount if you're doing HDMI or analog for the advanced ones. So is one better over the other, or are they same in quality? If you're talking about apples to apples comparison, the same N64 with an RGB mod and shielded cables going through the Tink 4K, the RGB output's probably going to be a little bit better, but it's not going to be a massive difference. It's not going to be like composite versus RGB. And it's definitely going to be better than without the enhanced S-Video features. But if you take everything into account, if you take a step back and you have the whole context of, I have an N64 that requires an advanced mod, or maybe I have a bunch of different N64s. I have, some of the different clear models. I have the Pikachu one, and, I don't want to mod all of those. So I just want to use those on my Tink 4K. I would call the enhanced S-Video better, quote unquote better, just because it's ease of use. You don't have to worry about anything. You could plug in any N64 and the quality is going to be really top tier. So I'll leave a link to the cheap adapter you would need in the back of the Tink 4K to do this. I'll see if I could leave a link to some shielded S-Video cables, but it's really going to be up to you. And the other thing is, what about your Switch? Which I'm getting a little bit, I'm getting a little bit deep into this, but if you have 7 consoles that are all RGB SCART going into your anything, Tink 4K, Tink 5X, RGB TV, whatever, and then you have your N64, how is that going to interface in? Doing an RGB mod and grabbing a RGB SCART cable would allow you to integrate that into a fully automated setup so you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. So I would say, hey, maybe that's actually the better thing to do because your total setup would be easier. But if that doesn't matter at all, then yeah, I would probably stick with S-Video and use the enhanced mode in back of the Tink 4K. But let me know if I got any of that wrong from what you were expecting. But that is definitely my thoughts on the Tink 4K and N64 S-Video versus RGB. Next up, Oliver Clare had a couple of questions about the Sinden light gun on Mister, and they missed the live stream and wanted to have some follow-up questions. So let me give you a quick recap of the live stream, just so you can understand why I'm going to be so unbelievably useless to you this week. The stream started out fine. I got the firmware loaded. The gun seemed okay, and then the installation instructions were still in very much beta, do it yourself, whereas Andy's looking to script everything to make it much easier for other people. So I tried to get around that. I tried to not do the very clear instructions that Andy had laid out because I was trying to figure out how we could install this in an existing setup easier. So that was a huge problem. Then on top of that, Andy was making changes to the GitHub just coincidentally at the same time that I was streaming, which I probably should have just given him a heads up, but I try to do these streams whenever I can. So very often I don't realize I'm going to stream until 5 minutes before I do. Like, wait a minute, I don't have something I have to do for the next 3 hours? Okay, stream time. So that was part of it. And then also it seemed to be a hardware issue because I think the gun that somebody was very kind enough to give me a couple of years ago, which sat in the box that they sent it to me in for years, my apologies, but I was really waiting for this, for Mister support. So I could have damaged the gun. It could have been an issue with the launch edition guns. My gut's telling me I accidentally did something to it, but it seems like there was an issue there as well. So basically it was a 2-hour live stream, and the only thing I got right was updating the firmware. So I talked to Andy. He was kind enough to send another gun my way, so hopefully that'll arrive soonish and I'll be able to retest all of this stuff. I sent the other gun back to him so he could check it out and see what I broke on it. And then as soon as that happens, as soon as I get the new gun, I talk to Andy. We're going to try to do a live stream where I do what I wanted to do the first time and test it out on Mister. So I'm going to go through your questions because they're excellent questions that I want to know the answers to. But my answers, except for the last one, are going to be guesses. I know the answer to one of these, but do Mister drivers for the Sinden light gun support all the main varieties of the gun, the recoil, non-recoil, and the GRS Target Pro shotgun? And I would say if they don't, it's probably coming because I don't think that's going to be a limitation of the source, but I'm talking out my ass here. I'm guessing. So I think they will all work at some point eventually if they don't work now, but I will confirm that with Andy. And anybody in the chat who knows that I'm wrong about this, please feel free to correct me. I always try to be very honest about when I'm guessing, when I'm pretty sure, and when I know what I'm talking about. And these are mostly guesses. 2, is the Sinden Time Crisis USB pedal supported? I believe it is, but I'm not, or I believe it could be, but I'm not sure how they would be able to pull that off because Mister would see these as a different controller. Now, that said, it sees spinner controllers as something different. So there's definitely a way to make this the pedal register as something else. And I don't know if it's possible now, but it's actually something I'm asking my Linux friends about because I'm also wondering if in Linux you could do something like assign a hardware ID to something and launch automatically. So for example, you have to manually launch the Sinden light gun software on the Mister, which is a good thing because it is a bit CPU intensive. So if you don't need it, then why would you be using up the CPU on the Mister, which is used by some cores? So that's a good thing. However, wouldn't it be neat if you plug in the Sinden light gun, it automatically, or have it plugged in upon power on, it detects that it's there and auto launch the script. I don't know if that's possible in Linux or even on the way Mr. uses Linux. It definitely is in Windows, that's for sure. And if that is the case, can you do something where if you plug in the pedal and the gun, it automatically assigns the pedal as buttons on the gun? So I'm once again wildly speculating here. Maybe I'll bother Veronica and see if she knows anything about auto launching on Linux and stuff like that. I think it's got the potential to do both of those things, but I don't know if it could do either now. Next, how are games like Time Crisis 2 facilitated? The original setup had 2 players with 2 gun controllers on 2 screens using a single board in the arcade version and a link cable on the PS2 home version. So I don't think that would be possible. I don't think that's something that's going to work, especially if you would need 2 Mr. setups, at least right away. Now, of course, at some point, if snack adapters are available, you might be able to do something like use snack to link them together. But I think at the moment, that stuff is not really going to be something that you could do. However, I'm pretty sure you could just use 2 light guns for games that could support it. So if support comes to the Saturn core, you should be able to do that for Virtua Cop and stuff like that. And maybe even for Lethal Enforcers on Genesis. I would love to see that in action. So hopefully that's something that could come in the future, but that's going to take some creative scripting and some other stuff. And the last question, the one that I actually have an answer for, a real answer for. What would I recommend for a minimalist Mr. build for people like themselves who mainly use original hardware but are interested in a dedicated Sinden setup without needing to spend $500 on a top-of-the-range pre-configured Mr. bundle? Only 2 choices in that specific scenario. My favorite, of course, the Retro Castle HDMI only kit. They're small, they're compact, they're well priced. However, if you're really on a budget, I would wait a couple more weeks and see if Taki's Mr. I hate calling it a clone, the Mr. Alternative. It's not a clone. Taki didn't steal anything from anybody. It's the homebrew version of the DE10. I would wait to see how that works, because you might be able to just pick up one of those in a RAM module and not even use a case. And maybe you might need a USB hub too or something, but that might be the cheapest way to get in. Or maybe Retro Castle is going to make a case around that, or maybe Taki's going to have the whole thing with a case in there. So if you're really looking for budget options, I would either hold off or kind of just think about what I said and pick what's best for you and see how you could approach this from the least amount of money. Because while I would never call some of those Mr. bundles, like the M3 Mr. for $650. That is not overpriced at all, but it's not cheap. And I completely understand how a lot of people want to get into this without spending extra money. So those are my recommendations. For something in a case where you don't have to worry about shorting out or looking like a crazy science project, the HDMI only Retro Castle is absolutely my go-to and probably will be for a while. And you could also buy the case only and try to use one of Taki's kits with it. Or you could just wait for Taki's and go from there. So it really just depends on, do you want to assemble anything yourself? Which I think it's fairly easy and most people could do. But yeah, so maybe after, maybe remind me again if you could when I go to do the stream with Andy and I could try to figure out all of this stuff. But great questions, and I can't wait to learn the answers to all of them, because the Sinden light gun really has potential to be what many people go to just because of the setup. I mean, once this is done, you should just be able to load a script, launch the custom core, and that's it. There's no other setup. So that alone might make this something that more people would want to use. But we'll see. We'll see how the latency is. We'll see how it performs. We'll see if I like it. And I'm brutally honest as always, because I would be useless to you if I wasn't. So we'll see how that all goes. But excellent questions, and hopefully I could actually answer them at some point. Well, that's it for this week. If you have any questions at all, please just ask them wherever it is you support in the latest Q&A post, because the way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, I really like just scrolling through them and having a conversation as if we were hanging out somewhere, which often ends up in mistakes and not as good answers as I could, but I really just like the laid-back chat format of these, and I really enjoy doing them. So, as always, thanks to everybody who participates, and especially thanks to anybody who supports in any way possible. possible, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.